Welcome everyone to a new episode of Alafo's podcast. Today I have the pleasure to be with Dr. Rochelle Scheuermann. Thank you so much for being
My
with us.
pleasure.
Dr. Scheuermann is a professor in Wheaton College, and we're gonna talk about her last book called Disability and Evangelism: The Good News of the Fullness of God's Kingdom. Dr. Scheuermann, thank you so much for coming.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Great to be here.
Tell me a little bit about your story. If you don't mind, a little bit of your personal background and your academic background, and how you came up with this idea with this book.
Sure. So I have always felt called to ministry, and God has just taken it in a very circuitous, winding way. And I ended up teaching here at Wheaton College. And so I've done pastoral ministry. And then I went back and got some education, and always thought that I would somehow be involved with missions and evangelism. But then when I got into my doctoral program on intercultural studies, I actually started studying preaching and thought that, oh, maybe my trajectory in research and writing would be preaching and culture and the ways that we can communicate God's word better. After I got out of my PhD, I ended up teaching first at Lincoln Christian University, which is where I met my husband. And as we began our family, we added two children into our family through adoption. And when we adopted our son, it completely changed my life because my son has Down syndrome. And so it thrusts us just immediately from 2 weeks not knowing that he existed to 2 weeks later holding a little boy with Down syndrome going, oh, what have we just done? It really changed our lives because we were thrust into a life of disability. As I began to try to understand his life, what that meant for us as a family, we started having experiences even when he was really young where people were discounting him at the church. They thought he was cute and he was great as long as he was in the nursery. And then when it was time for him to advance with his peers, people started pushing back and saying, oh, I don't know if he can actually be with his peers. Is he going to get anything out of it? Can he follow directions? And I started asking myself, wait a minute, the church is supposed to be a place where people can come and know God, experience God, and grow in God. And they're actually sort of dampening that for my son and pushing him. And so I asked, what is my discipline of intercultural studies, of missiology, where we are thinking about God's mission and heart for the world and how we connect God's mission with people? What does it say about disability? And suddenly I realized it doesn't say much. And so it shifted my entire focus from thinking about preaching, even though I'm working on disability and preaching now, it shifted my ideas of what I wanted to research and write. So fundamentally, that my focus really now is about how do we understand disability and bring people with disabilities into the church. So as I teach here at Wheaton College, for a while, been working in evangelism and leadership, started saying, well, how do we think about evangelism and disability? And it started this whole book idea of how do we understand God's mission in terms of people with disability? And then how do we actually reach and incorporate people into the church so that they can actually participate in the work and witness of the church? That's kind of my background. I've been here at Wheaton now for I'm starting my ninth year here, and it's just been a really fun ride to be with my family, and as we've learned and grown as a family with disabilities, and then bring that experience into my teaching and my writing to really help the church.
I have to say that there is a crazy stats that it shake my world that 90 to 95% of 1 billion people with disability have not heard the gospel. That struck me. That is crazy to me. Like, I think we missed something throughout the history of the church regarding that. You open your book with the story about a woman asking you if God will fix your son Down
Right.
syndrome. Why does this interaction is highly problematic? And you also talk about a logic of production. Can you deep dive a little bit more about that in the church?
Yeah.
And also how does that imply that disability is a mistake uh, rather than a part of God's glory?
Yes. The story that I recount is that I was at a women's Christmas event just trying to have fellowship, and a woman approaches me and says, "Wouldn't it be awesome if God healed your son? And do you think he would change his physical features?" And I was so hurt by the encounter and struck that she looked at my son and all she could see was, here's a problem that needs to be fixed. And I didn't know what she wanted him to be healed. His Down syndrome certainly does have areas where it can cause challenges, but it also is so fundamentally part of who he is and the ways in which he interacts with the world. And he's given us such a window into God's kingdom. I kept thinking, what are we trying to fix here? And why is this a problem? Why is his physical feature even a problem for her? And I realized that often we are thinking about what can people produce? What can people contribute? How are they the best, the smartest, the most capable? Because that's what we're looking for. What we kind of count as this logic of production that if this person matters, they're going to be contributing to everybody else. And what she saw in my son was that he had nothing to contribute because he was disabled and had a learning disability. And it was so jarring to me. And so I've had to really step back and say, well, what does my son have that he can contribute to the world? And there are so many ways in which his life is teaching me principles of God's kingdom that I don't think I would ever have gotten in any other way because of how I get to do life with him.
Could you name one of them?
So I think one of them would just be this idea of slowing down, that I am always hurry, 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 got to do this because I need to get things done off my list. And he reminds me that so often all of these little frenzied things that we do don't matter. People matter. Being in the moment matters. Just having a genuine, I am focused on you and I am learning from you matters. And so that's one of those ways where I got so busy, I would fail to see people around me, which meant that I was just walking past and not actually having a genuine encounter. And he's taught me that there are so many things that I think matter, my accomplishments, to do list, whatever, people matter. And I've been able to see other people and actually spend the time to slow and be present rather than always trying to rush off to the next thing.
That is incredible. Let me go back to the statistic I just told you about 90 to 95% of people with disability out of 1 billion have not heard the gospel. To what extent is this a result or to our own discomfort or the misconception that inclusion required advanced training?
So I think there's a couple things going on. One, when you're looking at the global space, a lot of different cultures and religions have different ideas about how disability fits in the world. So some people automatically are pushing people aside because they're fearful of people with disabilities, or they see it as a curse, as witchcraft, or as something else. And in that statistic, I think we're dealing with different cultural and religious worldviews of how people view disability. But I do think that we in the church so often think disability requires advanced training, it requires special knowledge, it requires tons of money. And if we don't have the vision, the money, people power, the resources, it's not even worth us being able to jump into that space. And in part, I think there's also even, especially when you're thinking about like an intellectual or developmental disability, sometimes we don't even think those people have the capacity to know Jesus or maybe don't
Yeah.
need to. And so we're not thinking of how do we minister to this lost soul. We're just thinking, oh, this is going to tax and be a burden to us. And so the church hasn't always been an open space because we haven't always seen people with disabilities as being central in who God wants us to reach.
I think even when we talk about the liturgy in our present in with especially with church, uh, we don't give much attention to people with disabilities. I don't see a lot of Bibles in Braille. I don't see like Especially with the sound and the music nowadays, when it's highly loud, and we don't think about people with autism. Maybe families won't go to church just because of that. How do we manage that? How can we be more uh, aware of of the mission of the church with that?
Yes. My mom has had that experience, and I actually talk about it a little bit in the book. Her church was getting loud. It started flashing lights in people's eyes, and it was like all the flash and the bang, and it kept triggering migraines for her. And so she went to the leadership and she just said, "Hey, is there any way we could by chance tone this down?" And they handed her earplugs and said, "Put these in, and if that's not enough, go wait in the lobby until it's done." And she ended up with in what she calls this holy huddle of people for whom the volume was being such a problem that they actually couldn't be in the sanctuary. And instead of being told, "We need your worship to participate as a whole body," they were told, "Just wait in the lobby till we're done." And she was so hurt, and she says, "Does my worship not matter in the church? Like, why don't they want that?" And I think that when we're thinking about these things, sometimes we're thinking much more about what kind of quality do we have? What's going to be attractive in terms of being expert or loud or flashy or contemporary, rather than saying who is missing because of how we're doing this? How are people like what worship is being missed because we've not made a space? And I think if churches would just be sensitive to how can we include the maximum number of people in this space, everybody benefits because then we get to hear the worship of people that are different than us and know that their voices count in that big multitude that God wants before his throne.
Hmm. Wow. Why study the story of disability at default is problematic to you?
Yes. A lot of times when I hear people talk about God's story, we kind of tell the story as if the only way that people with disabilities exist in the world is because of the fall. That everything that we deem is different, a different way of being embodied, a different way of experiencing life, that has to be a result of the fall. And so for my son, the story that it kind of goes is that he wouldn't have this extra chromosome if Adam and Eve hadn't eaten the fruit. And then
Mm,
that turns us into if the fall is where imperfection, what we deem as imperfection enters into the world, then the ultimate goal is for that to go away. And so we start telling the God story as the pinnacle of creation is perfection, right? Everything was perfect. Then the fall is where imperfection comes in. And because of
mm,
Jesus, we're going to get back to perfection. Rather than telling the story of this is God's story. It's a love story of how God created us to draw glory from us and to help us to bring glory to him. And the fall mars that ability for us to live in the way that most honors God, and he's restored a way for us to live in a way that honors him. And so when we start with disability only in the fall, then we don't really leave a place for people being created as good in God's image or have a place in God's kingdom without them being fundamentally changed while the rest of us just, God glorifies us, but nothing much has to change about us, but we have to fundamentally change other people. So many people that I talk to that have disabilities talk about this is my life. Like, this is how God created me. This is how I experience life. And to be told that I have to be healed in order for God to accept me in heaven, that's not a good news story. I want to know that God accepts me as I am and that, yes, He's going to take my suffering and my pain and my sorrow, but He doesn't discount everything about my life simply because it's not normal compared to what other people think a life should be. And so that's why I find if we start the story and people tell my son, "Hey, you know what? God's gonna heal this Down syndrome, and when you get to heaven, you're gonna be normal, and you're gonna have a certain
mm,
IQ, you're gonna look like everybody else." That's not the kind of diversity that I think God wants in his kingdom, and I think we miss out on the benefits that the disability actually does bring to all of us.
Do you see a difference between your son's condition or any other condition and let's say blindness or deafness? Would it apply the same?
You know, uh, so it's just kind of interesting. Different people embrace their disability in different ways. Some
Mhm.
people that have their disability from the time that they're born are much more acceptive of their disability than maybe somebody who acquires a disability later in life because of an accident, an injury, an illness. And I have noticed a difference that some people are like, nope, God's going to heal us. And when I get to heaven, I'm going to be running around. My eyes are going to be open. I'm going to see. And other people are going, oh, I hope in heaven God still keeps this. And so I think there is a little bit of a difference between how people experience disability, where that disability comes from, and certainly the kinds of pain or suffering that it can cause. The deaf community, a lot of people will say God is deaf. And like when we get to heaven, I don't need to hear to fully experience God because I have so many other ways in which I am just, and my other senses are so taking over that I actually have greater abilities than some people that can hear. And so I think is just kind of an interesting space. Certainly, we're speculating about heaven, but I think there's probably a lot more diversity that's going to be there than we typically like to say.
I think it's a problem when people just assume, right? This is what's gonna be, especially with scatology.
Yeah.
Like you don't really know, you know?
I do think too there are some things that we label a disability that's just a different way of being embodied. The longer
Mm,
life goes, the more we're identifying all of these things and trying to say, this is normal, that's not normal. This is normal, that's not
mm.
normal. Sometimes those boundary markers have changed over time. And certainly, I think there's some ways that, my autistic friends are like, this is how God made me. I just communicate in a way that's different than how you might communicate, but it doesn't mean that it's bad or problematic. So I think there's also a lot of things that we label as problems that just aren't.
Do you think social media might be might emphasize that problem about us looking to perfection in every way? Because most people just upload, you know, the good things, the good
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. I think that definitely, I think social media is becoming a revealer of what's been really in our hearts and in our culture.
Mm.
Um, we already have a tendency to look for perfection, achievement, being the best, being the smartest, the brightest, the prettiest. We have this whole industry of trying to have this ideal body until we're almost getting distorted images of what a body is supposed to look like and how a body is supposed to function. And I think social media just exacerbates that because here we are, we can make our image it whatever we want it to be. And the problem is that once we've so fabricated our lives online, we become very disgruntled with the actual bodies that we do have, right? So we like the picture where we have just the right pose and it doesn't make me look too fat. But we get very disgruntled with our own bodies that we see all imperfection or what we perceive as imperfection as problems. And so I think you're right. I think social media definitely can play into that sense of we need to have this ideal. It's just not reality.
I kept thinking about what you say about the focus of the church, right? When it used to focus on those people, especially with disabilities, and that kind of shift. If we think about, the early church, Christianity was one of the first movement that started taking care of the orphans, uh, people with disabilities, and because back then people would throw them out in the roads or I don't know through you know, and they will be discarded to society. Uh, a long time ago, I have another episode with somebody specialized in social sciences, and he would talk about Jesus going to the people, and going to the people in need. And nowadays, as you say, as pastors, as minister, we we tend to take care of the church as a whole but not with the same focus socially and to go out and and preach the gospel to everyone. Let's talk about the Imago Dei, the image
Yeah.
of God. You say that traditional, structural, functional, and relational approaches of the Imago Dei can often exclude those with disability. Where does this model get into trouble? You say the structural approach, the functional approach. Talk to us a little bit about it.
Yeah. So when we think about the Imago Dei, we think, what is the image of God in us? Because God doesn't put his image in the rest of creation. So somehow it makes us distinct. What is it that makes us distinct? And the structural view of the Imago Dei thinks that there's something inherent in how we are made as humans, the kinds of capacity that we have is what actually makes us function like God. And so we have rational thought, we have self determinism in ways that animals don't. Animals move by instinct, and we can move by choice. And so we can have these rational thoughts. The functional view says, okay, it's not necessarily about who we are. Imaging God is much more about the tasks that we do, that we need to um, basically rule and reign in creation in a similar fashion to how God rules and reigns in creation. And that requires capacities to rule, to create, lead. And so when we just focus on Imago Dei in those ways, it's very easy to say, well, if somebody doesn't have the ability to have rational thought, or somebody cannot be independent and determine things for themselves, they must lack the image of God. Because if that's what the image of God is, it's something of who we are. People that lack those capabilities, we say, it makes it harder for us to see them as being made in the image of God. The functional side, if we say it's about tasks, again, somebody that can't do certain things or lead in certain ways, we say they lack the capacity to actually rule and reign. And we start calling into question whether or not they have the imago Dei in them. And we forget that there is an inherent value and worth in them, that the relational model does start pushing us toward, that says we are made to image God. Now it's to show God, to display, whether that's through rational thought or through the ways in which we care for one another and love one another. That shows us how it is that we image God.
And I think that's the root of what I just told you before about the early church. That's what started everything, the doctrine of going to the needs, right? How does your proposal of representational, personal, and covenantal is the word? The view ensure that no person is ever disqualified from being locus of God, divine presence.
Yeah, so I'm borrowing from Mark Cortez, who is a theologian that looks
Right.
at theological anthropology. So he talks a lot about Imago Dei. Part of what he really emphasizes is that our understanding of being made in the image of God begins with a God who desires to be personal, God who desires to be in covenant with us, and who has created us then to live in that personal covenantal space with him. And so as we think about what does it mean to have the image of God when God has already been so personal with us, it reminds us that the Imago Dei does come to everyone. That God has created everyone, and He desires to be in personal relationship with everyone, which means that Imago Dei extends to all humanity, and there's no uh, capacity, there's no ability, there's no skill that's required in order to have that. God is wanting to be in relationship with all of us. As we think about then what does this look like, a kind of representational, personal, covenantal understanding of Imago Dei was first to Jesus, who was the ultimate image of God. And we see that even Jesus in his own body, as he's glorified into heaven, we just had Ascension Day this last weekend and celebrating Jesus ascended. And he has a physical body, and that physical body still carries Mars, still carries scars. And so
Mm.
it's not a perfect body that goes into heaven, but it is certainly a glorified body that goes into heaven. And so as we start looking to Jesus, we can already say, oh, even people with disabilities can find themselves in Jesus. And that same imago Dei that is in Jesus is also in us, even in our imperfections. And it means that we're created to be personal beings, to be in relationship with others. And again, that doesn't require certain capacities to love other people, to care for other people, to be in relationship. So there are times that my son is not able to verbalize something, but just his presence being with him, he is in relationship with me. And that is truly, I think, a representation of the fact that he has God's image in him and is living out that image through his love and his care and his concern for others.
You mentioned that the disabled God and the gospel of lament. And this is a topic that it caught my attention. I mentioned before that I focus on theology of suffering. Uh, it does the disabled God suggest that Jesus' resurrected body is still carried the mark of this. Oh, this is what you just say, right? About the mark of
Mhm.
disablement. What does it reveal about true personhood and identity? And why was we embrace the gospel of lament? What is it, first of all? And why how does it sit in the brokenness of Romans chapter 8?
So, when I talk about the Gospel of Lament, I have a chapter where I'm trying to say, how do we understand God's story and disability and put these together in ways that when we talk about God and the work of Jesus and the work of the Spirit, and we're trying to, witness and tell others about Jesus, how can we gospel in ways that are attentive to people's lives? And in one part, I'm saying we shouldn't always just focus on the tragedy of disability because there are points at which I just want to celebrate my son's life. And if the only gospel that somebody can tell me is how tragic and woeful my son's life is and how God's just going to fix him in heaven, it's not a great news. And so I, in part of saying, part of the ways that we gospel and tell Jesus' story is to celebrate. But disability really carries suffering. It really carries tragedy. There are ways in which my everyday life can just be so exhausting. I just talked with somebody last week, and he's like, we just live in a state of exhaustion. And we just think we can't take one more thing. And then here comes the next thing. And there are moments when we're trying to share God's story with other people that we want to rush to everything's going to get perfect and be okay in the end. Yeah, this is bad now, but you know what? It's coming. It's coming. Just and what the gospel actually gives us is space to sit with the tragedy of fall and with sin and with the suffering and to say, you know what? Jesus entered into that space. He was a person he came to this world, and Isaiah talks about how he was despised, he was rejected, people mocked him, people, he wasn't the most beautiful, he wasn't this or that. And yet in that, he was God with us. And so I think there's something to be said about as we engage other people and help them know how God intersects with their life, it is not just we're rushing to everything's going to be beautiful in the end, so just hold on. But there's a real space in the Christian faith that says, you know what? There's a lot of really tough things in the world, and Jesus gets it. And that's why I think that this gospel of lament is so important as we think about.
In theology of suffering, there is a theologian that marks three movements. He say from silence to lament, um, from indifference to compassion, and finally from loneliness to community. And I think most of the times, uh, people who has this kind of life, right, of struggles, the church is silent about it, doesn't reach out to them. Uh, Actually, the word compassion from the Latin it means suffer with. You know,
Yeah.
people are not willing to go and suffer with whoever is having trouble in their life and help. So as you say, it makes perfect sense to me that the end is coming from loneliness to community, to embrace everyone with the fullness of the gospel. I don't know if that's your story, but a lot of people just suffer in silence because they feel shame about what's happening in their life,
Yeah.
and the church is not doing the work of embracing that with them. You know.
I think one of the things too, and as I'm listening to you, makes me think we do it wrong so often because when we start a church service, I've heard this so many times where people say, I don't know what you faced this week, how hard it was. Let's just leave it at the door and we'll just come in here and worship. And I want to say, no, grab the baggage, bring it in here as you worship because God wants all of it. And we almost make it, we can't
Yeah.
bring the suffering into the church. And so we separate it out there and then we end up suffering in silence because the whole time we're like, oh, I'm not supposed to bring this in with me. Maybe God doesn't want this. But as soon as I get to that door, I got to pick up the backpack of suffering and go off into the world. Other than saying, you know what? Actually, Jesus gets suffering and he wants all of you so that he can be in all of it.
Yeah, yeah. I seen that, especially I come from a Pentecostal background, so I seen that a lot. You know, even to the point of saying, you shouldn't be sad because God loves you. You know, and God is with you. Why would you be like that? Why would you have depression? You know, and it creates shame in people, and that's why people keep silence, and that hurts them more, and sometimes it make them even you know, go away from the gospel because they don't understand the true gospel of that. Let's shift a little bit into the practice of evangelism and conversion. How does shifting from a logic of production to a logic of bearing witness change how the church measures success?
Yeah. So often we're thinking of a church is successful if the budget's going well, people are coming into the church, our buildings are in good shape. We're looking for church services that are just scheduled down to the minute so that it's perfect and it's beautiful. And if those things are happening, we feel like we're doing really well as a church. But we've not necessarily looked around and said, how are we in the kingdom of God and who is missing from that embodiment? The moment we shift to how is it that we actually worry less about it's got to have this kind of quality and smoothness and money behind it to how do we actually live in community with one another so that we're actually receiving the gifts from one another and bearing witness as a community. I think that that shifts the way that churches should be enacting all the things that they do. How is this actually enacting God's witness versus we're going to do these things and that proves that you know, we've got it going.
You mentioned iconic witness, and you already talked a little bit about your son just presence being you know, be able to communicate about the gospel. Um, how someone with an intellectual disability can communicate the gospel through presence alone? Give us a little bit of some examples of
Yeah.
it.
So, iconic witness comes from a theologian named Ben Connor, who's out of Western Theological Seminary. And he was looking at people with intellectual disabilities and saying, okay, maybe they don't have words that they can actually fully articulate this deep theology and give a full witness of Jesus. Are they excluded from the ability to witness of Jesus? And he's like, no. And he draws on this idea of iconography where you're not worshiping this figure, right? But that everything in the picture of the icon is a symbolism drawing you to focus on Christ, right? So you have an icon of Jesus and the colors and the shapes and the way it is put together are supposed to draw you into thinking about who is Jesus and how do I encounter him more. And he says that's what our lives are. We're actually icons where even if we don't have the words to articulate, we can actually live in a way that shows something different. So I think about my son and the ways in which he brings care and concern to others. People can be really upset, and he doesn't know to walk over. Hey, what's wrong? How are you? Can I help? You know what? Jesus cares. He loves you. But in his witness, he can walk over to that person and he literally will just sit with them. He may tap their back, and that's all he needs to do. And there are times in my own life where I'm upset about something and he can just come over and in his presence with me exude love and care and concern. And I think there's ways in which people that might not have words can actually live out that witness. They can participate in activities of the church. They can participate in passing the peace, can participate in, all of these functions of the church without words, but in ways that their presence is one that we go, oh, ooh, something just fell over in my office. Sorry. But thinking about ways in which, if they're not present with us, we actually miss something in their lives. And so I think that's one way that he really is this icon of witness to me is just in how he approaches the world, what he teaches me about what matters, and the ways in which he is in relationship with other people.
Do you think, talking about the gift, people kind of awaken different sensitivities, people with disability? As you say, let's say people in the church might not approach someone that is sad because it doesn't show it. But maybe your son will go to them and tap them in the back, kind of like I know what you're going through. You know, do you think that is possible?
I absolutely think that that's part of how that iconic witness happens. I think there are times where he actually senses things that my daughter doesn't necessarily sense of how people are feeling because he's so clued into of what he hears orally. So he's paying attention to a lot of other things to get his clues. And so I think disability, as we call it, sometimes can just mean that you lack an ability in one area, but you have greater ability in other areas. And we sometimes forget that those abilities exist and that because of the disability, those things are actually attuned to be part of God's witness.
That it's awesome and give you a lot to think about. Let's talk about the three dispositional practices: accommodation, seeing people, and interdependence. What is the double empathy problem that you mentioned? How does receptor oriented communication place responsibility back onto the speaker?
Yeah. So my friend Abby introduced me to the double empathy problem and basically said that so often when we are encountering somebody with a disability, we're expecting them to accommodate and change and become more like us. They need to fit into our world, our space, talk like us, act like us. And she said, in an autistic space, people with autism often are the ones that are having to make the accommodations. They're trying to learn new social cues and ways to communicate. But she says the problem is that you need to meet us part way because it's not just that the way we communicate is hard for you, the way you're communicating is hard for us. And so she says, what happens if we actually look at this impasse and say, no, it's a two-way street and we both need to maybe make some accommodations toward each other? And so my practice of accommodation, I draw it from a communication idea of being receptor oriented, which basically says when we communicate, rather than us saying something and the person listening to us having to figure everything out and come to our space, understand our words, our culture, whatever, we understand the other person enough that we say, how are they going to best communicate? What words, what images, what stories best match their experience so that I can speak in a way that is as easy as possible for them to understand. And so I have turned it from just being a communication principle to a life principle and saying, how is it that I can live in a receptor oriented way where I am constantly thinking, how do I adjust so that it is easy as possible for the other person to benefit, participate, and receive? And when that happens, we're not making accommodations for another person just to get along like us. We actually make accommodations in order to make it as easy as possible for that person to participate.
And going next to the seeing people, how does our enslavement, you mentioned it, enslavement to time, productivity prevent us from seeing us people at this, you mentioned the speed of God. uh, Develop a little bit about that. Personally, I learned a lot about that because, you know, as I say, especially in Pentecostal background, they want you serving all the time. Monday to Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And if you're not moving, you are wasting your time for God. If you are not on the move, if you are not, evangelize, which is good, but there is a point where you have to rest. There is a point where you have to slow down. And even in worship, as we talked about before, sometimes we don't need the excesses for worship. We just need, quiet worship, quiet time with the Lord. So talk to us a little bit about the speed of God and the slave.
Yeah, so that idea comes from John Swinton in this fantastic book called "Becoming Friends of Time." In it, he's talking about the fact that when Jesus was on Earth, he walked at just kind of a normal pace. It was probably about 3 miles per hour, and he said,
Right.
that meant that Jesus was walking with people. He was spending time with people. He was noticing things. He could stop when he needed to stop, and he was never in a rush. He just walked at the speed of time, or at the speed of God. That's what he calls it. And he says after Jesus rose from the dead, time didn't change. Like, he continues to walk with us and be with us so he can be in relationship with us. So often we're thinking about, what does this person contribute? How can we be more productive? I think about things like AI, where we're using it to increase our capacity. So it's not creating more space for us to be with other people. No, let's make this more efficient so I can do more, earn more money, become better, achieve more. And in that process, we're not actually spending time with people that need a slower pace. We're afraid to slow down. We're afraid to be off track. And people with disabilities will cause things to slow, they will disrupt things, just because of different ways of being embodied. I have to slow down with my son. I can't just zip along because he's not following me. He doesn't understand. He might physically not be able to do something. But if I slow down and just walk at the pace of God, right? Then God is in that moment. And it can be okay that I'm not just producing all the time, but I'm learning to be. And I think God is as concerned about who we are and our being in relationship with one another as he is about how can we actually do things that participate in God's kingdom in really well done ways.
Mhm. Yeah. When I became a parent, that it teach me to slow down as well. Because sometimes I will go to my secular job and then I will study and then I will do ministry, and my daughter is just looking at me like, "Hey, Dad, let's play," and little by little I have to learn to stop and say, "Okay, let's play. I'm gonna give you your time, your priority time," you know,
And to
and
learn to
and
not see
it
that
it
as
teach
a
you a lot.
detriment, right? "Oh, I didn't get this accomplished because
Yeah,
I had to stop and play." It's like, no, the playing is the thing. The being with them is the thing,
yeah,
not
it's the
this
thing.
other thing.
It, yeah, and we fear often, if I stop, I'm gonna fall
Mm,
behind.
yeah.
Not only in my schedule, I'm gonna fall behind everyone else, and especially in ministry, which is kind of crazy. We think it's a race and between each other, which is absolutely crazy. And let's talk about the last one, interdependence. Church is actually disabled without the disabled. How does mutual vulnerability flip the worldly script on independence?
Yeah. So even though we talk about the church needing one another and that we need gifts from one another, often the church still elevates an individual experience, right? I choose Jesus and I live for Jesus in my own little pocket and I come and go and I'm not really interconnected with other people. Disability requires interdependence. You can't get away from it. And sometimes we look at that even in the church, it's kind of a bad thing. Oh, they can't do this. I have to be with them. I have to help them. And when we don't have people with disabilities in the church, I don't think we truly understand what interdependence looks like that comes from this idea of being vulnerable with one another, that we have needs and it's okay that we have needs because guess what? Everybody has needs. Turn certain needs into things that we either can pay for somebody to fix those needs for us or ignore it. And it's like in the church, we're all vulnerable. We all have things that we can do really well, right? The foot can do one thing that the hand can't do, but the hand can do things that the foot can't do. We sometimes still worry about, well, I want to do it all and I don't need other people. And when you have people with disabilities in the church, it does require that interdependence in a way that says, what is the most important thing? I think about our church, oh, a bread that we make every week for our communion. And we've realized that not everybody can take that because there's gluten in it and there's milk
Yeah.
product. And we have some people that really have issues with that. And we've started asking the question, is the important thing the tradition that we've always had this particular recipe for our communion? Or should we experiment and come up with something new so that everybody can eat off of the same loaf? What is the purpose of
Mm.
communion? The purpose of communion is about the body of Christ, helping one another and to bring the body of Christ that was broken for us and the blood of Christ that was shed for us. And so I think as we start thinking about how are we interdependent and how are we related to one another, it becomes less about my personal preference, my personal way of being. How are we fostering the community and giving communal witness of who Jesus is?
And also during services, I experience, the preacher in the middle of the sermon, just because some kids are making noise and you can tell they have autism. He stopped and then he say, "Please take the kids out," and that really hurts. I mean, at least in my personal view, it hurt me because it's like, just go along with it. This is a church. This is not an event. This is not a. Doesn't have to be perfect. We want to aim for perfect, and so I think we should build the service with that kind of inclusion to say, if you bring your newborn baby, it's gonna cry, you know, and that's fine. That's fine. We go along. Just focus on the preacher, you know. So we have a lot to learn and to meditate and also to fix in church globally and especially in America, especially in the U.S. Uh, as you say, with this perfection team also coming from social media. We want the perfect video,
Yes.
so we don't want anyone
Yeah.
crying around because it's not gonna have as much views as the perfect sermon. In the open table, you mentioned of all abilities instead of disabilities. How does adding of all abilities to a mission statement fundamentally change a congregation?
Yeah. So sometimes people, when they think about disability, they're thinking, I've got to have a special calling. It's going to take all this time, resourcing. And yes, there are aspects of time, money, and resourcing that come into play. But the starting place is not, do we have the bandwidth, the calling, or the space to include people with disabilities? I think it starts by just fundamentally just shifting our perspective and say, okay, what is our church's mission statement? Now, let's make sure that if we're talking about people, for example, my friend I talk about in the book from his church, Front Porch Church. They followed the main church's vision statement of helping people find their way back to God. And he says, yes, people includes everybody, but by just adding the words, helping people of all abilities find their way back to God. Suddenly we're clued into, if it's people of all abilities, then when I see this autistic, I'm thinking, how am I going to help that child find his way to God? And then when we see this person in a wheelchair, we're thinking, how can I help this person find their way back to God? And when we see this family and that person and somebody with disability, somebody with that ability, suddenly it's not a, do we have the bandwidth and we're coming at it from a negative, but we're saying, you know what, if it's people of all abilities, mm, that's just going to shift the way we're thinking about our, big Easter service. How are we going to help people of all abilities encounter the risen
Mm.
Christ through this service? And suddenly you are thinking about sound, lights, space, what you're wanting people to experience rather than shoving the crying kids out or the noisy kids out. You're saying, no, everybody's going to have a welcome space. How do we set the table in that way? And I think just that little bit of a shift in language can make a big difference in shifting our perspective.
Do you think people should kind of prepare, let's say in the children ministry, right? Sunday Bible school. Should people have some kind of knowledge about, let's say, people with autism, or how to deal with those kind of behaviors? Or do you think we give enough emphasis nowadays in that, or do you think we should do more?
I think actually, like in whatever ministry you have, think about the people that would be coming or could be coming and say, how would I be able to respond to this? Certainly, when we think about autism, right? The statistics are saying that I'm trying to remember what the statistic is. It 1 in 37 kids have autism or something like that, or 37%. I can't
I think
remember
it's the,
which way the stat goes. That means that there's likely multiple kids. If you've got 10 kids in your kids ministry, there's going to be some that have autism. So began thinking, okay, if the statistics are telling me that people are dealing with this, what are some basic things we need to know? But I think another way to approach it too is not just we think we've prepared and then we're just going to force that preparation on people. But as every person comes in, we can say to each family, hey, help us get to know your kid. What do they like? What do they not like? What are their strengths? How do they learn best? What would help this child have a good experience here? And when you do that for everybody, you are making a space for people whose children might have disabilities to be able to say, hey, you know what? Sally here has autism. And so she's going to need a little bit more direct communication. She's might fidget over here and just give her a little space. If you notice this happening, if you could give them just a moment to, you know, get up, walk around, and then come back, they'll be able to sit. I think as we make space like that in all of our ministries, statistics show that churches are more likely to, if they're going to work with people with disabilities, it's more likely to be children. And as they start aging out, less in youth group and much less as adults. We want to disciple adults all the way through from birth to the end of life. So how are we actually asking those questions to say, how can this person best participate? And then doing the hard work too of trying to train and read and expose ourselves to other ways of thinking about people with disabilities.
Mhm. Yeah, great. And that brings us to the last topic of our conversation, spectacular hospitality, you name it, as part of the DNA of a church, rather than an add-on. What do you mean by spectacular hospitality?
Yeah, I think of being a church in every way. You're thinking, how can a person experience welcome in this space and not feel excluded, pushed out, and singled out? So often we have like certain ways of doing things. We want everybody to fit our mold. And instead, a church that has just spectacular hospitality, it's kind of a missional concept of we're a church that in our DNA, we say, we want to be hospitable in every way. How can we make this space a space of hospitality? And then we're starting to ask questions. You know, this person in our church recently had an accident and they're now in a wheelchair. Even if it's temporary, how are we going to be hospitable to that person, welcome that person in? How are we going to be hospitable from the pulpit as we talk about disability? Or maybe we've ignored talking about disability from the pulpit. How do we actually talk in ways that make people with disabilities feel seen from the preacher as they're preaching? Not in a way that you have to be healed, but just normalizing the experience of disability. And so I think as we look at each part of our church life, how we're preaching, how we're teaching, how we're discipling, how we're welcoming people into physical spaces. We're just constantly asking the question, have I set an open table that allows people to come and feel like they belong? And if there's any group of people that walks into your church and says, I don't belong, then you've not quite tapped into what is true hospitality. And that it's not just about what do I do for you, but it's also what can I receive from you? So we're not just looking, how do I minister to people with disabilities, but spectacular hospitality is as much about learning to receive and receive hospitality from another person, which means also seeing every person that walks in your door as somebody that has something to contribute. And we need to do what we can so we can receive those good gifts from them as well.
Well, Dr. Scheuermann, it's been a pleasure listening to you about this spectacular book, Disability and Evangelism, The Good News of the Fullness of God's Kingdom. It's truly, truly necessary nowadays for church. It's much needed. And especially, I have to say, with the Spanish speaking community, the Hispanic community, we have a lot to learn from that. There is a lot to learn, especially uh, with the liturgy, as we talk about how the service is being conducted, and especially from the theological perspective, as we view disability. It's mind blowing, your perspective about shifting that from the fall to creation, and how can we see people with disability and how we can really bring the fullness of the gospel, the good news, right, to everyone. So I thank you. I thank you for that. Thank you for your work. Uh, Tell us a little bit. Are you working on something else? Something new coming up soon? Is the same topic? You mentioned preaching and
Yeah.
disability,
So
right?
I recently did a lectureship where I was exploring preaching and disability. I'm currently working on a book proposal to actually write a book about how do we actually understand disability from the pulpit in terms of how we read scripture, how we actually communicate from the pulpit, and ways to make our sermons more accessible to people of all abilities. And so it's still a work in progress, not yet ready to be seen, but it is something that I feel like becomes the next step in how we think about just normalizing and really speaking a deep theology to our understanding of disability.
That is awesome. So everyone, disability and evangelism. So it's published by IB Press, and you can find it on Amazon. All the links are gonna be at the description. And well, Dr. Sherman, thank you
Thank you
so
so much.
much.
It's been a true pleasure.
Where can we find you? Likewise, where can we find you? Do you have any social media, or maybe
I
you
don't
can talk
have
about
a
Wheaton
web
College a
page
little bit?
yet, but if people need to want to reach out with questions, you can always find me on the Wheaton College website, and it has a link to
Hmm.
my email, and you can certainly capture me there.
Okay, if you don't mind, I put it on the description as well, and people can ask all the questions,
That's right.
because this is a great topic. This is a great topic, a very important and much needed. So again, Dr. Sherman, thank you so much for your time. I
Thank
appreciate it.
you.